Hi, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about license is a nuisance, and we're going to be talking about the challenges of open source compliance for containers. So my name is Maryam. I'm a software engineer at Pivotal.
I'm Ramya. I'm also a software engineer at Pivotal.
And our agenda for today. So we're going to do an intro to open source licensing. We're going to talk about why it's hard to be license compliant for containers, how to detect if our software actually contains containers, how to figure out which software is in the container, and then how do we find the licenses for that software. So most of us here write software.
Oops.
Okay. How do I go to the beginning? All right, let's start again. Most of us here write software. And it automatically gets copyrighted. So without even having to file anything, your software is immediately your own and is protected under international law. I'm just going to use the I'm not good at this.
Okay.
All right. So why do we have licenses? We want to promote innovation, basically. When people feel that they can own their own work, they can control who makes money from it, and they can have their own exclusive rights to it. And we have all distributed copyrighted software. So a lot of us have probably looked at Stack Overflow, and we see people pasting code from different places. We all have linked our friends to GitHub repositories, and we've all done distribution, which is transferring copyrighted work from one person to another. But not all copyrighted licenses are the same. You have public domain licenses, which basically means you can do whatever you want. You have trade secret, which basically no one even knows it exists. And for software, open source software, you have the traditional OSS tends to be in the middle. So you're between permissive and protective. There are still some rights there, but it's not proprietary. And within open source software, you have two different kinds of licenses there. So you have permissive licenses and you have copyleft. And the permissive licenses are the ones that are more popular. So you've probably heard of the Berkeley Software Distribution, the MIT license, Apache 2. And for copyleft, you may have heard of GPL or Mozilla or Eclipse. And to see where they stand on the spectrum, the MIT license, for example, is the most permissive. And then you have Apache 2 is a little less permissive. GPL is more on the protective side, so that's in the copyleft field. And if you look at the most commonly used licenses, the MIT license is the most popular. I think I have a graph for this. So the MIT license is the most popular, followed by the GNU license, and followed by Apache. And basically, what do all these licenses mean? Like, what does it really mean to pick one license versus the other? Well, if you pick a permissive license, then you have basically three simple rules. You can do whatever you want with the code, as long as you acknowledge the author and contributor, and as long as you know that you're using it as your own risk, at your own risk. So there's no guarantee that anyone's going to support it or provide bug fixes or anything like that. For copyleft licenses, you have the same exact things as with permissive, except that you have these additional restrictions as well, such as making the source code for the binaries available, making sure that if you get code with certain terms, that you actually distribute it with the same terms, and not placing any additional restrictions. If you look over the years, people have basically been trending towards just using more permissive licenses for open source software. So what happens if we just ignore licenses? We just continue like distributing software and we don't really care. Well, bad things happen. You could go to jail, you could get fined, you might not be able to distribute that software anymore. Your reputation as a company or a person could be ruined. You probably want to avoid that. So it's really very simple. In order to just avoid copyright infringement, you need to make sure that for every single software that you distribute, you find the license for it and you abide by it. And you may be thinking, okay, that sounds super simple. Where is the nuisance part of this? Well, it turns out that it's a lot harder to find the license than you might think. For example, if I told you find the license for a repo that you cloned from GitHub, you can probably just scroll to the bottom and you can probably find the license somewhere there. So that's fairly easy. Say you're trying to find the license for a Docker file itself that you got from Docker Hub. Well, Docker files themselves have their own licenses, and it's sort of similar. If you scroll to the bottom, you should probably be able to find it on Docker Hub. You can probably find it somewhere. But if I told you to find the license for each of the packages inside the Docker file that you got from Docker Hub, it starts getting a little more complicated. And that's where we get to the point of this talk, which is that license compliance for containers is a nuisance.
So why is it a nuisance? It's a nuisance because the content of a container image is more complex than what you would expect. And many readily available images that you have up on the internet are built in really crooked ways. And let's look at some of those examples. So containers are complex. Why are they complex? Because they're made up of layers. Containers are based on union file systems. Each of these layers are file systems and branches of the file system, but they all look like one single coherent file system to you. Each of these layers could have a software that's added, removed, modified, anything. Each of these are instructions in a Docker file. And this is what makes Docker really efficient. And I'm just using Docker as an example of a container type. There are others. But this is why they're efficient, because you can cache these layers. But then when you look at this from a license compliance view, this is actually a nightmare. Sometimes containers surprise us. This is an example of a really simple container image. There are a Docker file. There are 2 lines. The second line gets a package from GitHub, downloads it, unpacks it, and then even changes it into an executable. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing this, and most containers or Docker files have this line. But you never know if what you're installing actually has a CVE or not. What else could go wrong? Now, sometimes people do incredibly dumb stuff in containers. For example, in this one, someone changed the source URL of where the packages are downloaded from in the Debian base OS and changed it to some custom URL. They also changed the priority of this URL to a higher priority from the actual standard distribution repository, and they updated all the packages. If you were to use this Docker file, you wouldn't know if your distributions are actually standard or non-standard, or if they were stable. You wouldn't know. So let's say you actually followed the standard practices, right? Let's say you had a container which is getting the latest Debian stable release. It's updating all the packages. You're getting an app from somewhere and installing it, and you have some local copy statements as well. All this is fine, but every time you run it, it's going to be different. For example, if there is a later distribution of Debian, that could be different the next time you run it. The app-get almost will be different every time you run it. And even for the custom app that you installed, you need to know at which point in time was it installed to make sure that the license for that was accounted. And even something in some local changes that you made, you need to track sources for those. So it's not simple even if you're doing something standard. It gets more complicated when there are licenses missing for softwares, or if some softwares are tagged with the wrong licenses. Let's say, for example, I took up an unofficial image of OpenJDK from Docker Hub. The author, or whoever actually published that, tagged it with an MIT license. But only upon finding or digging through, I found out that it was actually distributed using Oracle's end-user license agreement. So you have to be careful about these situations. What if you're actually using this container image, which has, in the last layer, a software has been removed, but you're shipping this. So anyone using this container can actually remove the layer 4 or the last layer and still use the container. So at the end of the day, you have to account for every software that you're shipping. There's also the fact that Docker files can be nested. Let's say you took up something from the internet, for example, like RabbitMQ. This is a Docker file that we found somewhere, and we tried to trace it. It was using another Docker file from Alpine, and so we traced that. And then we traced that to find that it was being built from scratch. Now, this is a really simple example, but you could have a more longer chain of Docker files, and it's your responsibility to go through this rabbit hole of finding Docker file to know what exactly you're shipping. So what are some simple things you can do if you have an app that you're distributing which has a container and you have a relatively small product? First of all, know your base OS. If you can build your base OS in-house from scratch, that is great, but not everybody can do that. Not everybody has the time and resources to build an OS. So use a base OS that is well known, for example, like Ubuntu or Debian, from which you can get the package list reliably and even get the sources from it, not something like BusyBox or like even sometimes Alpine. Keep track of what you're installing in your container in every layer. And if you're getting something from the internet, make sure you're getting it from an official publisher or get a certified image. You can also add metadata info about what packages are in your Docker file and save it with your Docker file. And last, include a license for any software that you created or you're distributing so that you don't put others in the same situation. Now, all this is good if you had a small app, but one of the problems we faced was that we had a really huge product which had many different teams contributing to this, and we didn't know if any one of them were actually shipping a container, whether there was open source software or not, and things like that. So what do you do in cases like those? We followed some simple steps. First of all, we needed to know if we were shipping containers in our software. Second, we had to find for each of those containers what software packages were installed on those containers, find the license for each of those software packages, and then review them with our legal team so that we are not in deep waters. So let's look at this step by step on how we can do it. Now, if you had a huge product, you can unpack that, and this is a fairly simple step. You can unpack that and find containers using either looking for Docker env or manifest.json files. This is how Docker stores the metadata information of all the layers, and you almost certainly know that you've hit a container when you have this. You can do the combination of the two. Next, analyze each of these containers to find what software is installed in them. For example, you could use Docker's save command, which gives you your image into a tar, and then you can untar that into different layers. For example, how we did it here, where we went into the layer directory, and each of those had directories and files in them of which softwares were installed in them. You could also use Docker's history command to find out what changes have been made recently. And don't forget the base OS, especially. You have to include packages that are installed in the base OS as well, because at the end of the day, you're shipping that as well. So for example, this is for Ubuntu. We just found out the list of packages that were installed and what versions they were. Apart from this, there are also tools outside that can help you do this. Now, when we were doing this, we didn't have these tools, but now there are. For example, there's VMware Turn, there's Dive, and there's Container Diff. We know a little bit about VMware Turn. It mounts the Docker file that you can give, that you have, and then it tries to get the packages from the base image and then inspects each of the install commands to know what's installed on your Docker file. Another example was Dive, which actually gives you a nice UI of inspecting your Docker file as well. So these are some of examples you can use to analyze your Docker container.
So at this point in step 3, you have figured out which parts of your software are containers, what software is in those containers, and now you're just trying to find the licenses for that software. And thankfully, this is the part that there's already some pretty good tools that take care of this. So for example, one of the tools that we have used is License Finder. And License Finder essentially assumes that if you have installed your dependencies with a dependency manager, it will literally output like this output that you're seeing right here, where it just gives you the name of your packages and the licenses for them. Another thing that we have supplemented License Finder with is Fussology. And one of the nice things about Fussology is it also can do a diff, and it only changes files. It only scans files that were changed since the last time that it ran. And this can really speed up our entire process during release time.
So the last and final step is the legal review. And this is the fun part because you give all those licenses that you found out from all the software that you found in your containers to your legal team. And then they go through each of those licenses painfully and find out if you are in trouble or not. And most often they come back with some software that you either have to remove or replace or find an alternate one that you have to get a license for. But hopefully by this time you've checked your sources and made sure to have software only that has licenses and just being good open source citizens.
All right, so we're going to do a review of some of the things that we talked about today. So first of all, if you're going to distribute software, please abide by its license, otherwise there are consequences. After that, keep in mind that when you're dealing with containers, a lot of times there is layered images. And so like an image is comprised of another 2 images, another 3 images, and so you have to approach it with a mindset of digging deep to the bottom and being able to find all of the images that is in your image. And once you do that, you want to be able to look at the set of dependencies and inspect them. And you have tools like VMware Turn to be able to inspect the Docker file and be able to find the actual list of software packages that are included in your Docker file. And once you have the list of software packages, you can then use Fussology to try to get the licenses for those packages. And the nice thing is that the next time that you release, you get to do this all over again. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Yes.
So I used to honestly go with the license finder, and that it's stressful until you're forced to care about licenses. We'll call that happiness. And then after being forced to care about licenses, we'll call that not happening. Because, as you said, you have to give it to the legal team. So my process was when we were building some pivotal files. You generate this massive, like we literally rewrote something from Java into something not Java, just to get away from the smashing of Java dependencies.
Yes.
But so what are some examples from your projects where the legal teams come back? And what is that process? How long does your legal team take to come back to you and say, no, and this one needs to change?
So earlier, it was taking us a month from the time we shipped our product to actually getting it reviewed. Like this was the steps in between these steps. It's now down to 2 weeks from our end. The legal team usually comes back to us within 2 days, as long as we have given all the licenses. Most of the time, the process has hiccups in between when we don't know what's in it and when we are missing the licenses. So we find it before that.
So what are some examples? Without guessing, but what are some example licenses that the legal team say no to?
What are some examples of licenses they say no to? I'm trying to find an example, like something recently where someone had forked a GitHub repository of a Golang package, but they did not have a license at all in the GitHub repository, but we had used that, and they came back to us because it got flagged in Fussology that this doesn't have a license. So then we went in and found a similar one, which was not forked by someone else, and used that. And we didn't even know that some team was doing this. So, yeah. I can give you more concrete examples. It's been a while since I did this.
Also, security is a big thing. Like sometimes just a CVE will come out by the time it gets to them.
Yes.
Less of a question, but more of a remark to say no. If you find or you use software without the license, can always ask the author of that package to supply one.
Yes.
I had it a few times and it usually works pretty fine.
Yeah.
Like I've got plenty of projects where you just forgot, didn't know it was a license, or like, it's like, you're sure I can
It's
put a
usually not on
license.
purpose. And
Thanks for caring. Thanks for caring enough that you want a license.
Usually that is the case. Sometimes some projects haven't been updated for years, and you find that the author has forgotten about it and they're not responding to your emails or your messages on GitHub. It's possible. There's been one instance where we used that in our CI, at least I know.
maybe one question, are the slides available somewhere?
It's on schedule.com, yes, we did put it up.
Have you had success pushing this problem back to the dev teams?
To the dev teams.
Yeah, so as opposed to being a release process, you've just added a new pin, you know, this thing has no license.
Yes, that's where it actually reduced from 4 weeks to 2 weeks. That's when we pushed it back, because earlier it was on a team which was doing all the legal processes, like all the license finding for us, and they had a problem finding licenses for containers because they didn't have any software like that yet at that point in time. And so they would push it back to us to ask each team, like, if you have a Docker file, then you go in and do all the things and just give us a list of the packages. So then we started doing that, and we wrote the few scripts. So the steps 1 to 3 that I talked about is actually the dev team doing it. We just had some simple scripts that found containers and analyzed each layer for the OS release, found out all the container dependencies, and then actually manually even sometimes went and got the GitHub URL for those because we couldn't like get those from the tools. Yeah, so it was usually pushed back to the dev team because we know more about it than the people who are doing the licensing.
I have so many more questions. Do you think, this goes back to dev teams, so like a lot of us, we make our libraries and whatever, and it's not our problem that you then use my project and have a licensing issue. But do you think there's a future where licenses should be gradually aggregated? Like there should be some sort of continual meta file that comes with all projects. Says here is all my dependencies of licenses. Not just my license, but my project uses these 17 other projects, and here is the aggregate license. Can you imagine that future? And imagine how that might be tooled?
I have high hopes from VMware Turn. That's a good way to analyze containers. I don't know if like as a whole program, if it is possible, because there's a lot of collaboration involved in developing a tool or something of that sort beforehand. We haven't been able to do that, at least, considering sometimes there is collaboration with cross companies, cross teams, different time zones, etc. So it's been a little hard. I don't see that in the near future. That's my opinion.
Well, we didn't used to have licenses either. No one used to care about licenses.
Yeah, but
Something changed in the last 10 years, and also most projects have licenses now.
when they knew that someone can sue you, yes, for that, yeah. Like things that you didn't know you were shipping. Yes?
How deep do I have to dig to find out the licenses? So if I find a package which has license, can I trust it on a legal basis, or do I need to see if they use other things and mislabeled it or something like that? So if I use a package and it's mislabeled, whose fault is it?
Okay, so if it's on GitHub and you have the license on it, that's actually the author who has added it, right? But sometimes if you're using like a Docker file that's made of another Docker file, I think that's where you have to be careful. Like this is one instance where I saw the OpenJDK example that I gave. This Docker file was OpenJDK, it was an unofficial image, and it was on Docker Hub, and the author had tagged MIT license to that. So maybe that's something you don't trust, like because it's on like Docker Hub. You actually have to be careful about what's inside and not trust that. As to how deep you have to go, I think all the layers. That's what we did, because at the end of the day, anyone can unpack each layer and have that as a container image, right? So.
That means that you basically can never trust any license out there until you're sure that you reach the base level, like the person who invented it.
That is true, yes.
That sounds horrible.
That's why nobody wants to do it.
That's why it's a nuisance.
What is the risk of not, of being wrong? What are the possibilities of it? I mean, what are the penalties? Like, you screw up your licenses, or you don't do it at all. Sell enterprise software, and I apologise if I came on this part, I apologise. But where does this become a problem other than in your own minds, your own legal team? Like, if I didn't have a legal team to yell at me and I just started selling software, I wouldn't know I had a problem. So where would that come back and haunt me later on?
Do you want to take that?
I mean, it never bit us. Sorry, I'm so tired. Like, I think certain things were broken for some time, and then we decided to start fixing them out of, well, security being, I think, a thing that everyone started paying attention to, and if everyone's looking at it, then you have to fix it. But I think that legally, there have been cases, but I think with really high-profile companies, and I think with, like, if you were making a substantial amount of money, that you attracted attention. But I don't think it's been a thing yet where people get sued for it commonly.
Yeah. I think even with the Docker containers, I think there was a certain point where no one knew about it, and the lawyers could say that I didn't know that we were like shipping this. There's like some ignorance aspect that you can use, but not to a full extent. Now I don't know. I'm not legally like educated enough to answer that. Yeah, but I know that that has been done in the past.
What is the risk of, not the risk, but what is the,
I think that's just take that.
Well,
Ask them to take it down.
technically, if someone finds that you have violated their terms and conditions, then they can ask you either to pay money, or they'll ask you to take down your software, or not ask you to ship it, close you down.
or, if it's GPL, I don't know if you want to get into a GPL conversation, we have time, but like, do the pivotal lawyers say don't use GPL, or do they just say make sure you do what the GPL says and ship the version of forks?
We do what GPL says. And I think they're more careful if there is GPL in it. Like they make sure I think GPL says that you have to bundle the source code with it, and that's what we do.
Is it bundle source code or just bundle any changes you make?
Sorry, what?
Is it bundle the original source code or is it just bundle any changes you make? Is that what the point of GPL is, to make sure that any changes you make?
I think GPL, there's two clauses. There's version 2 and version 3, and I think, if I'm not wrong, version 3 is more permissive, that allows you to modify and ship it. I may be wrong. I think the version 2 was more restrictive on, you just had to ship it as is without any modifications, as far as I remember from what I read.
All right.